It's working. Hello and welcome everybody on this steamy hot afternoon in early June. Uh, I'm glad you all could come out to hear the signature lecture this afternoon. My name is Jennifer Clapp and I'm a CG Chair of International Governance at the University of Waterloo. And I'm pleased to welcome the speaker for this afternoon for the signature lecture, who is Madame Louise Frechette. And she will be speaking on the UN and the fight against poverty. Does it make a difference? And this talk is actually a keynote and opening address for a smaller workshop which will be held this weekend on the theme of global governance, poverty, and inequality. And we're very pleased that Madame Frechette has offered to give this lecture for us as a way to map out some of the key themes for us to think about in our deliberations this weekend. And it's a very appropriate time to be discussing these questions of poverty and inequality in a context of global governance. And in the world today, we're seeing a number of converging crises. We're seeing not just environmental issues like climate change, not just on the horizon, it's actually here as we're witnessing and experiencing this today. At the same time, we're seeing a crisis of rising food prices, a crisis of rising energy prices, and at the same time, we're seeing a backdrop of a looming global recession as a result of financial instability. And we can't forget that in this context where these crises are converging, it's often the world's poor who suffer the most, who are the most vulnerable to these very crises. And so we have to remember this when we think about issues of global governance. How do global institutions like the UN address these kinds of problems? And in many ways, these are the key issues of our times, and they're affecting the majority of the world's population. So these are important issues, and Madame Frechette is well positioned to elaborate on these issues and to give us food for thought on these various angles. Madame Frechette is, as most of you probably know, she's Canada's highest ranking diplomat. She has enormous experience. She was 8 years as the UN Deputy Secretary General, where she worked extensively on overseeing reforms in the United Nations. She also has a distinguished career in the Canadian government. She was ambassador to Argentina, ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations. She was Associate Deputy Minister of Finance and also the Deputy Minister of National Defense. And she's also an Officer of the Order of Canada. She has a very distinguished career in terms of her positions on various boards of numerous charitable organizations. Madame Frechette also is currently a distinguished research fellow here at CG. She joined CG in 2006, and her interests are wide-ranging from issues of security to environment to issues of poverty and inequality. And here at CG, she's overseeing a major research initiative on the revival of nuclear power across the world and what are the security and safety and global governance implications of this development. So she has a vast range of experience, and I know she will give us lots to think about this afternoon with respect to the big issues of poverty and inequality and the role of the UN. And I know these are issues that Madame Frechette cares deeply about and has thought and worked on extensively in her time at the UN. So with that, I will pass it over to Madame Frechette.
Well, thank you very much, Jennifer, for this very generous introduction, and thank you for all of you for being here on such a wonderful, warm, sunny day. It certainly is comforting to know that some people are prepared to sacrifice this wonderful day to come and listen to me, so thank you. Now, Jennifer knows that I hesitated very much before accepting your invitation to deliver this keynote address. The workshop that opens today at CG on poverty, inequality, and global governance brings together an impressive number of real experts on the subject. Some of them I had the pleasure of meeting in my UN days. All of them are much better qualified than I am to discuss that very complicated subject. And I must say that I'm very, very pleased to see here Sylvia Austri, former colleague from the Foreign Affairs, but more importantly, I don't know whether you remember, Sylvia, but we were roommates for, for about 3 days in Montevideo, Uruguay, where the Uruguay round was launched, and we shared an apartment for about 3 days. I'm delighted to see you here, Sylvia. Because there are so many real experts in the room, I decided to play it safe and talk about something that I know a bit about. And that's why I chose to talk about the UN, and particularly whether the UN makes any difference in the fight against poverty. And let me start by stating a couple of fundamental facts as far as I see them. First is that the role of external actors in reducing poverty and inequality in a given country is only one factor in a complex process in which endogenous factors are equally, actually probably more important. If I've learned one thing in my 8 years as Deputy Secretary General, it is humility. People everywhere want to be masters of their own destiny. At the end of the day, societies make their own choices. Strategies elaborated by outsiders may be momentarily embraced, especially if they come accompanied by big checks. But their impact are of short duration unless governments and societies truly own them, to use a current buzzword. Second, of all the external factors at play in the fight against poverty and inequality, two stand out in my mind as particularly important: the financial and trade rules within which countries must operate, and the amount of outside assistance that is available to them. On both these counts, the United Nations is a small, if not marginal, player. The trade and financial rules that govern the world are clearly the domain of the Bretton Woods institutions and the World Trade Organization. Developing members of the UN, or at least their foreign ministries, would much prefer to see the General Assembly, or ECOSOC, play that role because they hold a majority of votes in these two bodies. But this is not likely to happen anytime soon. And the pronouncements emanating from the General Assembly and ECOSOC on financial and trade rules have rarely had more than a marginal influence. UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, has been somewhat more influential and has served a very useful, if sometime contested, role as a brain trust for developing countries in trade matters, since there is no organization outside the UN capable of supporting developing countries' trade agenda in the way that the OECD does for the developed countries. The UN Conference on Financing for Development, which was held in Monterrey, Mexico in 2002, did reach a number of useful conclusions on this vast subject and was hailed as a major achievement. In reality, I think that conference broke little new ground. Its main accomplishment was to put finally to rest some old debates, particularly with respect to the relative roles of private and public investment in development, and set the parameters of UN deliberations along more contemporarily relevant lines. In other words, Monterrey allowed the UN's discourse to catch up with reality. While I was at the UN, there were several other attempts to strengthen the organization's voice on financial and other systemic issues through various ministerial level dialogues. They never amounted to anything and left participating ministers from both North and South equally frustrated. As for financial flows, those channeled through the UN amount to approximately $10 billion a year, nearly half of which is for humanitarian assistance, that is, emergency relief. $5 billion for development programs is not an insignificant amount, but it represents a very small share of total ODA, now standing at close to $120 billion a year. To the extent that influence is commensurate with the amounts of money involved, The World Bank is clearly the giant external actor in the poverty reduction field. This said, the United Nations is in many other respects a central player in the fight against poverty and inequality. To put it in a nutshell, I would say the UN contributes to it by being a provider of peace, a provider of norms, a provider of knowledge, a provider of assistance, and a provider of inspiration. And I'll get back to that later. Let me elaborate. The connection between the UN's action in peace and security, by this I mean the word in conflict prevention and mediation, in peacekeeping, in post-conflict peace building. Now, the connection between this work and poverty, it seems to me, is plain to see. Conflicts may enrich a few people, but they will surely impoverish the vast majority. There can be no progress in poverty and inequality reduction when guns are blazing. Since the end of the Cold War, the UN has become much more engaged in situations of civil conflict, and its interventions have served to mitigate their impact on civilian populations and kickstart the rebuilding of societies after conflict. The number of people deployed in peace operations under the UN flag is currently close to 110,000 people. It's the highest ever number. They are helping to create minimum conditions of safety and security and channel international efforts to tackle the numerous problems, including those related to poverty and inequality, that are faced by countries emerging from conflict. To be sure, the UN's performance in the many peacekeeping operations created since the end of the Cold War has been uneven, and the massive presence of foreign soldiers, police officers, civilian staff, along with armies of bilateral aid workers and NGOs, has often created its own sets of problems, abuses, and distortions in the local economy. But I would argue that, on the whole, poorer populations have been better off with the interventions than without them. The UN and other international actors still have a lot to learn when it comes to supporting social and economic development in post-conflict situations. But I think the recent establishment of the Peacebuilding Commission is a welcome signal of the member states' readiness to remain engaged once the immediate crisis is passed and the attention of the Security Council is called to address other pressing issues. The UN is a provider of norms, among which the human rights norms seem to me to be of particular relevance to the issue of poverty and inequality. As is the case for most internationally agreed norms, enforcement mechanisms are weak or non-existent, except in the cases of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, over which the newly created International Criminal Court now has jurisdiction. Although human rights international treaties lack international enforcement mechanisms, they are tools that can and are used within countries, legally and politically, to challenge policies and practices that generate poverty and inequality. The International Convention on Women's Rights, for instance, has been used repeatedly in that fashion. The UN also produces what I would call soft norms, by which I mean internationally agreed strategies, programs of actions, and other non-binding decisions. Such agreements often commit states to report on action and the results achieved, thus generating pressure on governments, at least those with reasonably open systems, to show progress. These agreements establish a baseline of accepted standards and principles that should guide governments and can be invoked by civil society groups. The 1995 World Summit on Social Development, or the Cairo Conference on Population, offer good examples of the way in which the United Nations seek to influence policies at the national level. When I talk of the UN as a knowledge provider, I have two things in mind. First is the organization's work in the statistical area, an essential tool for effective action at both national and international level. The UN statistics offices work with national statisticians to develop common standards and collect information on a worldwide basis. They provide a vital service to the international community that is not sufficiently understood outside expert circles. Second is the analytical work of the UN Secretariat and that of the many agencies, funds, and programs. Year in, year out, thousands of reports are produced. Many of them are of little utility and are often mandated by member states to satisfy a variety of concerns, some more legitimate than others. But many UN analyses are of top quality and are considered works of reference in numerous fields, from AIDS to drugs and from education to private investment in developing countries. And I would be remiss if I did not mention the widely praised pioneering work of the UN Regional Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean on issues of poverty and inequality. The contribution of the UN as a provider of assistance in poorer countries is better known. The UN is present in practically every developing country in the world, and particularly in the poorest among them. UNDP and other agencies work very closely with national authorities to develop policies, legislations, and programs, many of which in the social development area. With the adoption of the Millennium Development Goals, the focus on poverty has sharpened significantly in UN field activities. The UN's effectiveness in that assistance function is often questioned. Too many agencies competing for too few resources, providing advice of uneven quality in an uncoordinated and wasteful manner. That's often how you see the UN operational system described. The reality, as I have observed it, is a little more complex. In some places, the UN family does a very competent job in a reasonably well-coordinated fashion. In some others, it does not. The quality of individual members of a UN country team makes an enormous difference, and I have come across really exceptionally qualified people in the UN system, but they're not all equally brilliant or highly qualified. Let's recognize that. Strong resident coordinators have managed to inject real coherence at the country level, overcoming the challenges of an inherently fragmented system in which each agency, fund, and program has its own independent budget and receives independent guidance from its own governing body. Many modest steps were taken in the last decade or so to strengthen coordination among the various humanitarian and developmental agencies of the UN. The creation of the post which I occupy, that of the post of Deputy Secretary General, was one of those steps, as was the move of UN entities to common premises as much as possible, the preparation of joint country assessments and joint development frameworks, for instance. But the bottom line, as far as I'm concerned, was very simple. When real commitment at the very top of the various organizations was in evidence, performance improved. When it let up, bad habits quickly returned. Rebuilding the UN system from the ground up to rationalize its structure and clarify responsibilities seems an almost impossible task at this point in time. But it should surely be possible to reform the current approach to funding, which is the source, in my opinion, of a great deal of competition and duplication. I kept for last what may be the most valuable contribution of the UN in the fight against poverty, and it is its capacity to draw attention and mobilize governments and public opinion around a cause. It is one of the most important functions of the Secretary General, one that requires vision, leadership, and at times, more than a little courage. I will never forget the visit I received from Patty Stonecipher, who was then the co-chair and CEO of the Gates Foundation. What she came to tell me was that the global effort against HIV/AIDS, in which the Gates Foundation was already engaged, needed a leader, and that, in their opinion, only the Secretary General of the UN could play that role. Now, Kofi Annan took this appeal to heart and raised significantly his own personal profile on the issue. And I think you can trace back to that moment the dramatic ramping up of the international campaign, which led to the establishment of the Global Fund and a huge increase in resources devoted to HIV/AIDS. The Millennium Development Goals, another UN product, so to speak, has put poverty on the radar screen of ordinary people around the world in an unprecedented way. I know the MDGs, as they're called, are not popular with many experts, but let's recognize that as an advocacy tool, they have proved extraordinarily effective to sensitize public opinion and governments alike. A more recent example is the burgeoning food crisis. I would argue that, at least in this country, Canada, it became a real front page issue for the media and public opinion when Secretary General Ban Ki-moon stepped in front of a camera surrounded by a senior team and rang the alarm bell. Now, it is much too early to tell whether the UN will be able to get its act together and lead the response to the crisis in the way it did in the case of HIV/AIDS. My impression, watching the results of the Rome conference, is that the challenge in this case is much more complex, with deep divisions among member states, and I'm sorry to say, evident tension within the UN team. My last example of the UN as a source of inspiration has to be the initiative taken by UNDP to issue the first Human Development Report, the brainchild of the remarkable Mahbub ul Haq. These reports and their ranking of countries according to various indices, health, poverty, education, contributed in a powerful way to shifting the debate on development from GDP and other financial measures to people-centered concerns, much to the displeasure of many countries whose performance was suddenly seen in a very different light. The same report produced by any other organization would not, in my opinion, have had the same impact. Why? Well, because the universal nature of the organization gives it unequal legitimacy and credibility in the eyes of governments and world public opinion. Indeed, the ability of the UN to perform effectively all the various roles I've described in this presentation depends to a large extent on the perceived legitimacy of its interventions and of its prescriptions. It is a precious commodity that has endured through the 60 years of the organization, with ups and downs, of course, but endured nevertheless. Whether we're talking of the authorization to use force, or the validity of human rights norms, or the credibility of statistics and analysis, or the acceptability of intrusive advice, or the UN's capacity to inspire and mobilize public opinion, perceived legitimacy is the key ingredient. So long as the community of nations recognizes itself in the United Nations, so long as it sees its decisions as the expression of the common will, the organization has a potential for effectiveness that no other organization can have. Much has been said in recent years on the need to improve UN management, to streamline its work program, to render it more cost-effective. All well and good, and I will be the last one to stand in the way of further reform in that direction. But frankly, my biggest worry about the UN lies elsewhere. It lies is what I see as a gradual erosion of the UN's perceived legitimacy. This erosion stems, in my opinion, from three distinct factors. The first is the now widely accepted view that the current composition of the Security Council is no longer representative of the world's reality at the beginning of the 21st century. The risk is that the failure to reform the Council will be used with increasing frequency to ignore its decisions and challenge its interventions. And the resentment towards the Security Council is compounded by the General Assembly's pathetic failure to make itself more relevant. more and more issues end up on the Council's agenda instead of the General Assemblies where they belong, because the Council is the only organ that seems capable of making real decisions in real time. But the net result is further alienation of the vast majority of member states whose turn to sit at the Council's table may come once every 20 or 30 years, if ever. The second threat to the UN's legitimacy is the perception in a number of developing countries, particularly in the Muslim world, that the United Nations is just a tool of the United States and of the West. This is the perception that the late Sergio Vieira de Mello, who, as you know, died in the explosion at the UN mission in Baghdad a few years ago. That's a perception that he encountered in Iraq when he had to explain to many of his interlocutors that the UN was not a Christian organization. This is a perception that motivated Al-Qaeda to bomb the UN office in Algiers on the 17th of December 2007, just last year, a few months ago, killing 17 UN staff members. The fact that the UN Security Council refused to sanction the American intervention in Iraq obviously has not registered with the most radical group. What they see is an organization that, in their eyes, is insufficiently supportive of the Palestinians and seem, again in their eyes, to be ganging up on Muslim countries from Sudan to Afghanistan and from Iraq to Iran at the behest of the American imperial power. Conversely, we have heard in the United States and elsewhere similar challenges to the organization's legitimacy on the grounds that its debates are often dominated by non-democratic countries. Some are toying with the notion of new organizations, like Senator McCain's League of Democracies, to supplement, if not replace, the UN entirely. The third threat to the UN's perceived legitimacy is what I would charitably describe as benign neglect by almost all of its member states. The memory of the misery visited upon hundreds of millions of people by World War II is fading fast, and with it, a visceral understanding of the raison d'etre of the organization. Nowadays, the UN is almost always described as something outside and distant from individual government. It's always talked about as they, when we should talk about we. An attack on the UN elicits no more than passing interest, even though UN staff are our public servants. How many of you had been aware of the number of people killed in Algiers last December? A similar attack against any Canadian embassy would have provoked revulsion, anguish, and a good deal of soul searching as to the implications of the event for our country. As far as I know, nothing of the sort happened in New York, other than yet another review of security measures around UN compounds. Perhaps the investigation underway under the leadership of a seasoned and outspoken former UN senior official will succeed in drawing attention to the profoundly disturbing implications of this attack and of this perception of the UN in a good part of the developing world for the UN and its future. For all the noise about UN reform, it does not rank very high in the foreign policy priorities of most member states. For reasons of protocol, I had to be in attendance in the General Assembly every time a head of state or government addressed the Assembly. I was struck by how little attention the whole issue of UN reform received, with the exception of Security Council enlargement, about which many leaders held very strong views. UN reform was evoked only in the most general terms, and only a handful of countries seem to have formed a coherent vision of their aspirations on this subject. Meanwhile, the impression is left with our public opinion that the UN is a hopeless mess, thus further eroding its legitimacy and credibility. The Secretary General is expected to explain and defend the UN almost all by himself. Public opinion will never be convinced to care about the UN if their political leaders around the world show indifference at best. Now, these comments have taken us, I realize, very far from the main focus of your workshop. But I warned you from the start that I would play it safe and only talk about things I know. The question I chose to ask myself was, in the global fight against poverty, does the UN make a difference? My answer to this question is emphatically yes, it does, directly, and a lot indirectly. Could it do more? Certainly. Could it do better? Of course. The UN has obvious limitations. It is an intergovernmental organization whose member states have hugely different interests, priorities, and concerns, and where politics are never absent. But it also has a unique legitimacy that allows it to do some things that others, not the World Bank, not the IMF, not the EU, not any bilateral donor, no matter how generous and disinterested, not even a League of Democracies can do. This is an asset worth preserving. A vibrant United Nations capable of curbing conflicts, promoting human rights, and mobilizing international energies to solve the challenges of our times is in the interest of everyone and, above all, of the poorest among us. Thank you very much. Question? Yes? Any question? No? Yes?
Thank you very much for this very good lecture, and I benefited very much. But I have two questions. Number one is, many prominent economists concluded this. It is the genesis of inequality, but not inequality per se matters. This means inequality is natural, but it is the unjustified inequality which brings problems and poverty. Therefore, to solve or to marginalize poverty, the unjustified inequality or the genesis of inequality should be dealt with. Therefore, what is your opinion on this? Number two, food crisis, prices of food is now higher and higher. But some economists also now started saying this. It is good trend. Why? Because necessity is the mother of invention. If problems coming, many developing countries will be more innovative and will solve their internal problems. And what is your opinion on this? Thank you.
You are inviting me to comment precisely on all these issues about which I don't feel any expertise whatsoever, and particularly on the issue of poverty and inequality. Um, I really have no expertise to answer your question, other than to say that while economists and sociologists and may all come out with their different take on the relationship between the two and how they influence one another. It certainly was my experience watching the dynamics of societies and those that were uh, uh, embroiled in conflict, that inequality often had a role to play. It was not necessarily an inequality that was based on just revenue or purchasing power. There are other forms of inequality that have to do with discriminations and lack of respect for fundamental rights or privileges accorded to one group against the other. And in that sense, I have no doubt that inequality is an extraordinarily important uh, um, dimension of social interaction. that must be at the center of any development strategy, but I will not go beyond that. Um, I don't know whether you're an economist, but you quoted one, and maybe in terms of the evolution of supply and demand, and that a sudden increase in prices forces adjustment, and you'll find another equilibrium, and it will generate innovation. That could well be true, but that's beside the point, I think. I think the main concern has to do with the fact that you now have suddenly hundreds of millions of people who last month were able to feed themselves properly and this month cannot. And the implications for themselves, for their children, for their capacity to send their children to school, for the health of the family members, suddenly this equation has been disturbed very profoundly. And therefore, there has to be a response that goes beyond simply, oh, well, the market eventually will find a new equilibrium, and new new inventions will take care of that. So I'm sure that you can demonstrate by A plus B that over a long period it will give this result, but frankly, at this point in time, now it is relevant in terms of the mix of responses that the international community uh, finds to deal with the crisis. There can be responses that will actually do nothing to strengthen the resilience of communities when it comes to their need for food, and just attend in a humanitarian way the needs of populations that suddenly find themselves unable to feed themselves. Or you can have other strategies uh, that will ensure that the the patterns of food production and distribution in the future is such as to minimize the risks of that sort of crises suddenly erupting. Now, beyond that, experts are here. Many of them probably have detailed answers to these questions. I don't. Yes.
Madam Frechette, Dennis Hilker. I'm curious about your comments on the UN, which you talked of in terms of the effectiveness and also reform. Many of our friends and just ordinary discussions and things that I read seem to be very critical of the UN in terms of the effectiveness in the world, the use of money, the use of goods and services and things like that. What actually is it that we cannot see some reform in the Security Council and also in the makeup of the UN?
Well, first of all, there has been an incredible amount of reform in the UN. At, in almost every respect, particularly since the end of the Cold War. The notion that the UN is a kind of static organization that has been unable to keep up with the times is just not true. 15 years ago, there was hardly any peacekeeping worth talking about. This notion of intervening in civil conflict, of deploying massive numbers of soldiers, police officers, civilian people to help avert conflicts and to rebuild societies. None of that existed. None of that was possible. The UN Secretariat had a handful of people in 1990 who could do these things, and over 15 years they developed a capacity that is far from perfect, but is better than anything around. So if that's not reform, I don't know what that is. Reform is a capacity of an institution to rise to new challenges and give itself the means, the tools to respond. And therefore, by any measure, there's been an enormous change in policy thinking. All the member states have changed. Who would have thought 15 years ago that the Chinese government would actually accept this notion that we all have a responsibility to protect civilian populations that are being abused by their governments? Who would have thought that they have voted how many times to support interventions by the UN that would have been unthinkable 15 years ago. So there's been a great deal of change. And in my intervention, I bemoaned the fact that while everybody calls for UN reform, apart from the Security Council enlargement, where people have a very, very precise idea, and I'll get to that in a minute, for the rest, I'm never quite sure what it is they want change. They want the world to change, yes, but to change the UN, it's an institution. What is it that would actually help the UN better deliver the results? Then people are never quite clear what it is that they want to change. On the Security Council, I'm afraid there's a lot of double talk about the Security Council. At one level, there's hardly any country that does not acknowledge that the current composition of the Security Council does not reflect the realities of today, that it really should be enlarged, bring in a few more permanent members, and somehow be more in tune with the world of today rather than the world of the 50s. But when you look at how they position themselves in relation to reform, you realize that so far, most countries have concluded that the current setup is better than any alternative they can think of. And it is particularly evident in the position adopted by middle powers, a country like Canada included, where what's the proposal? That a small number of countries that today are peers accede to a higher status. Even without the right to veto, I don't think new permanent members would get a veto right. But you would suddenly find some countries acceded to a different status. Japan and Germany and Brazil and India, and these countries say we should be there permanently. Well, there are peers today. So who do you think is leading the campaign quietly to prevent or to postpone as much as possible an enlargement of the council and an elevation of a few countries to the status of permanent members? Well, it's the middle powers. It's the middle powers, and you see that in every part of the world. And in every part of the world, there's great difficulty in truly rallying around a candidate and pushing hard for that country to be accepted as a permanent member. The Africans, 54 countries with a number of countries that have claims to become a permanent member, have resolved the problem by agreeing that they want 3 new permanent members. An impossibility. It's not going to happen. Nobody's going to concede that Africa should have 3 permanent seats. But Africa is incapable of deciding which one of South Africa, Nigeria, or Egypt should be their candidate for permanent seats. In other words, the interests of individual countries sometimes stand in the way of what would be in the interest of the organization, especially when they hold this dual discourse. If the majority of countries in the UN said, well, you know, it's not a big deal that we can't reform the council just yet. We still think that the Security Council has credibility and legitimacy, then it wouldn't be a problem. But that's not what they're saying. You know, just about every country. One of their key criticisms is the Security Council is not reformed, but they're the ones who are making it very difficult for this reform to happen. But for public opinion, it just, and especially in the developing countries who feel that they don't have a strong enough voice, it means that, yeah, their confidence in the organization is decreasing, and that's because national interests trump global interest very often. And that's not, and I'm not sure there's a reform that can reform that.
Thank you.
Madam Frechette, even though you touched upon the question I'm going to ask in your response to the previous one, my question was about the role of the United Nations responsibility for peacemaking as opposed to peacekeeping. Poverty is so often coupled or combined with oppression, natural disasters, and disease that people often suffer a great deal of difficulty after these things. And I think especially of places like Darfur, Burma, and also even Zimbabwe. Um, what is the United Nations mandate in being more proactive in supporting and helping those countries where their citizens suffer great human rights abuses and oppression that go beyond, the sanctions that are commonly applied?
Well, the interpretation of the UN Charter has moved a lot over the years. Originally, the UN Charter uh, gave a kind of absolute protection. It was read as giving absolute protection to state sovereignty, and the role of the United Nations in the maintenance of peace and security really was focused on responding to threats to international peace and security, and really of confrontation between member states. That was the original intent. 60 years later, the interpretation has moved well beyond that. So there is more a general acceptance of the notion that the UN has a role to play, certainly in Darfur, certainly in situations where there are failed states, no government, chaos, and all of that. There's not too much discussion. Um, a situation like Zimbabwe is a little more complicated because there you don't have a civil war going. You don't have, it's not a failed state like Somalia where you haven't had governments that really control the territory. But more importantly, I think the challenge is not so much whether the UN has a mandate or whether its charter allows it to do things, because, as I say, the interpretation of the charter can evolve, and it continues to evolve, is whether there is sufficient consensus within the UN member states to agree on steps to be made. That's one very important problem. I think there's been a number of steps where there was consensus in the UN to try to do something about Darfur. There hasn't been consensus in the Security Council to take any take any measure in respect of Zimbabwe. In fact, there was, I think, reluctance on the part of the African members of the Security Council to bring Zimbabwe on the agenda of the Security Council. You're left with other instruments. You have a Human Rights Commissioner, you have your humanitarian agencies that can act, you have the moral authority of the Secretary General that can have some influence. But if you want to mobilize the capacity of the international community, a united international community, that's where you can have a more definitive impact. And certainly in the case of Zimbabwe, I don't see that there is this willingness to act. I think if the African group were signaling that they want the UN to get involved, I think you could probably find a lot, it'd open up much more space. But for the time being, the African countries in the UN are not anxious to bring in the UN. In the case of Darfur, there's been more of a willingness by all to try to do something. But then you face a second set of problems, which is what will work. And all this debate about the responsibility to protect should include consideration of the extent to which the ultimate steps, which is to deploy troops against the consent of a government, is a viable option. And I think there's been struggle with this particular dimension in Darfur, and sometimes I find that countries are not sufficiently open about admitting their limitations or the limitations they put on their willingness to involve. So Darfur is a very good point. I don't know of any government at the moment that thinks it would be realistic to deploy military troops, Western troops, in Darfur without the consent of the government of Khartoum, because the risk of this intervention generating uh, 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 not only a resistance on the territory, but of meeting with very deep opposition in the Muslim world, makes that option not very realistic, in my opinion. And frankly, even if the risks were deemed to be worth taking, I don't know of any Western government that's actually prepared to send troops there. But what do they say? Did they say that? No. They say the UN is not doing anything. But who's the UN? They are the UN. So, long, convoluted answers to say that there are situations where there is no um, obvious or easy answer. The more united the international community, the more coherent the message, the more steady the pressure, the more there is a possibility of influencing. The NGO community stopped targeting only George Bush to do something in Darfur, and suddenly realized that in fact the country that probably had more leverage was China, well, you saw some modest result out of that, because China, when put on the spot and told, you have leverage in Khartoum, why don't you use your influence there? Well, actually they did and got a little something. There are other countries, I think, who are friends and neighbors of Sudan, who should be asked to intervene more than they have. I think a lot of countries just sit back and blame the UN.
Une autre question.
Louise and I were in Punta del Este together when they launched the Uruguay round. But the thing I remember best of all was sitting in the room and smoking. Those were the days, right?
But I quit years ago. I quit.
I mean, it sounds trite, but we're in a totally different world. It is the end of history. But one of the things that I think is clear, well, two things. We're in a new industrial revolution, what Alan Blinder calls the third, but we'll leave that aside, we'll discuss it in the rest. But I think that the question of the environmental degradation of the world is not something that can be left. So when I watched television and I saw in Myanmar the dead bodies floating, and then that the responsibility to protect was considered irrelevant. Yeah, I guess it's not genocide. But I think that this conference is about equality. And I think inherent in the new world, of which the environment to me is the most crucial aspect, is inequality. And I think that as environmental degradation gets worse, and there's been a lot of stuff, that it will be the poverty-stricken countries. And when they said this wasn't genocide, when they let the bodies float, that's right, because responsibility to protect is based on the past. But environmental degradation is the new world. And I just wonder, Louise, if there's any discussion in the UN about the need to make some kind of change to deal with the most powerful force, and it's going to affect security and everything else.
I think, Sylvia, you're absolutely right that the environmental challenge is probably the most, the one that has the most long-term consequences for humanity, and that the poorest members of society are the ones that are going to bear the highest cost because they, maybe in our societies we'll find ways to invent things to adjust and mitigate the impact of climate change. But you can be sure that in countries where people barely have enough to eat, they are totally at the mercy of the elements. Um, the, um, the climate change international process is part of the UN. It is a central element of the UN. Um, whether the Secretary General himself can contribute more forcefully to keep keep the issue on the front burner over, again and again and again. Um, Perhaps yes. I know he did when he took office, identify the environment as one of his priorities. But this is one where the interests of member states are so overwhelmingly evident that I think this is a case where the Secretary General, who doesn't have to be elected in any individual countries, has less as a as a standing that is less secure, that when he says, I'm going to lead the fight on HIV/AIDS or on even on this food crisis, how we deal with this environmental problem is absolutely central to how we're going to live and what the choices we're going to make in societies. And therefore, I think that the leadership will have to come from leaders in key countries and individuals who have the capacity to sort of look beyond all the constraints in front of them and inspire. And this is a case where inspiration, personally, I don't expect it to come so much from the Secretary General of the UN or the UN bureaucracy, although I think they're doing a very good job. I mean, the International Climate Change Panel has provided this basic, unassailable knowledge that is the reference to all the world. But I want to see leaders in the world that will make it their cause. And I don't see leadership on too many issues these days. That's not on environment, no, not on many others. And it is, I think, a reason to worry when we are facing such problems of such magnitude that we don't seem to have leaders around the world that are prepared to uh, invent the new paradigm and just bring the rest of the world behind them. That's because at the end of the day, the UN is a tool. It doesn't have the authority to impose. It cannot solve the problem themselves. It can mobilize. It can inform. But at the end of the day, it is individual countries and individual leaders that will make the difference.
We have time for two more questions. Microphone.
Hi, thank you for your talk. It was really interesting. You spoke at the beginning about the importance of the, I guess, poorer nations, if we can call them that, of owning the projects and initiatives that are going on, such as poverty alleviation, along with a lot of other issues. And I certainly agree with that statement very much. And I was wondering, at the UN, do you see that happening a lot with mostly the larger scale poverty alleviation projects? Is there a lot of buy-in and ownership from the poorer countries?
Well, I think country ownership has been the mantra of the entire development assistance community for, I'd say, 10 years now at least. And it's been embraced everywhere, including the World Bank, but there's a big gap between accepting intellectually that that's the only sustainable way for strategies to take, to grow deep roots. But between that and the actual practice, there's a lot of space. And I think some World Bank officials are more inclined, personally, intellectually, to do that than others. and you'd find the same in the UN. I think the UN is probably a little more agile in this kind of thing because it doesn't come with big money. So it's more in the business of providing information, providing advice, coaching. But so I think you probably have a little more understanding in the UN than in the institutions that have massive amounts of money. And I understand because the institutions that are spending large amounts of money on behalf of their shareholders also have accountability. They have to go back and be able to demonstrate that the money was well used, that there was no fraud, no corruption, and it leads to a more hands-on approach when there's a lot of money at stake. And I think the donor community has to realize that there are connections between these factors, that we have been singularly focused on accountability and the prevention of fraud and corruption and mismanagement and misspent money. But in order to have a perfect record of all that, the only way to be sure it's going to go exactly according to the book that you've written is to keep very tight control. So one has to accept a little bit of uncertainty if one is to embrace completely this notion that countries have to own their development agenda.
Hello, my name is Amin, and I would like to know what would you do about the 26,000 people dying every day due to poverty?
The 27 people that?
26,000.
I can't hear you.
What else would you do, what the UN would do about the 26,000 people dying every day due to poverty?
I'm sorry, the 26,000 people who die every day of
Poverty.
poverty. Well, I think the UN is doing a lot about that. It has, I think, focused very intensively on this goal of reducing poverty, and it is using all its capacity to help communities, to help governments, to put in place welfare programs for their people. They're helping to mobilize a lot of resources from governments, from the private sector, from foundation, because while outside money is not the only way, it is an important element in the contribution. So the UN, I think, has given a lot of attention to it. And the fact is, if you look at the history over the last 25 years, long before you were born, you see that in fact there has been a significant reduction in the number of people who live under the poverty line. Very important, particularly in Asia. I don't think we can rest on our laurels and say, oh, well, hundreds of millions are no longer living under the poverty line and therefore the job is done. But it's important to remember that we're not starting today. Efforts to reduce poverty has been going on for a long time. And it's mostly the efforts of the people in a country. The international community can help, support, encourage, but why has there been a reduction of poverty in practically all Southeast Asian countries, in India, in China? It's largely because of the efforts and the choices that have been made by the people in these countries. So one should not lose hope, because there is a lot of good happening in the world. And we have to be vigilant and keep at it and make sure that we don't slide back and that we continue to gain ground in this battle that we've all agreed needs to be fought.
Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for their question. We were we're, we have to cut it off somewhere, I think. Sorry. Um, well, I'm Daniel Schwan, and I'm acting director of the center this year. And Madame Frechette, I'm not sure I would dare summarizing something that you've just spoken on. But if I did, I would summarize it as the United Nations are us, and it's providing an essential context of peace and the setting of norms for the discussion that will be taking place tomorrow at the workshop, for the problems that you will be examining at the workshop tomorrow on poverty, inequality, and global governance. And it's also providing essential capabilities that will assist in solving some of the issues that will be discussed. Capabilities in terms of knowledge, in terms of advice, in terms of capacity to mobilize, in terms of inspiration. And I think that these are words that I think reflect also modestly what we're trying to do here at CG through the work that we do, the research, the workshop. So Jennifer, I want to say it was an inspired choice to have Madame Frechette as a speaker opening the workshop. I also would like to thank you, Madame Frechette, for your time, very precious time, and your ideas and your thoughts. I'd like to thank all of you for coming. Normally, I make an announcement about the next workshop, but I have a memory blank. But we have sheets at the front that will tell you what the next speaker here will be at CG. And I'd like to thank and welcome the participants of the workshop that are here tonight, are coming from Waterloo and from outside of Waterloo. Welcome. I'd like to welcome also our visitors from the Center for International Public Policy Studies in Japan. Hopefully this event gives you a bit of an idea of the work that we do here at CG and the capabilities that we bring to bear on the governance issues that we examine. So once again, merci beaucoup, madame. I have a little gift for you. And thank you all for coming. Oh, okay. So, I'm sorry. Of course, I should have known this. Our next keynote speaker this is a public event? Oh, that's fabulous. I'm sorry. They just tell me what to say. June 7th, that's tomorrow at 3 p.m. Mark Kingwell, pardon me. That's part of our CG Community Weekend 2008. And Mark Kingwell will speak at 3 p.m. tomorrow here, right here, on the topic of cities and consciousness. So another weighty topic, this one, I suppose, local, but very much linked to the global issues that we study here at CG. So you're all welcome to come and attend. So thanks again.